Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Terrace Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
I'm here for another Conversations, and this week we're talking about King Arthur.
Let's do it.
Yep, you asked me about King Arthur before, and I kind of deflected the question because I wasn't really ready to talk about it at the time. Right? I kept it on the back of my mind to talk about one day. So we can do King Arthur like this week and next week. I sat down and said I'll do like a quick overview in the first section, just to get you up to speed on King Arthur. And so I started researching, and before I knew it, I had like 4 pages of notes.
Of course.
Because it's really complicated. The first question which you have asked me is, was King Arthur real? And that's an impossible question to answer, because the answer is yes, no, maybe. But if he was real, nothing you know about him is true. No part of the King Arthur legend that you're familiar with, the castles, the knights, the code of chivalry, the plate mail armor and jousting and things like that, none of that was a part of the life of the actual King Arthur. The earliest castles were built of stone in the 11th century, and it took the 12th century before they could actually build really huge ones. Plate mail armor didn't come along until the 13th century. And by the 13th century, it wasn't the Dark Ages anymore. We knew who was King of England then, and he wasn't named Arthur. So by the time the technology was invented to have what we associate with Arthur, it was already recorded history. So there was no way, there was no time or place a person like Arthur and the Kingdom of Camelot could have existed. Which doesn't mean he wasn't based on a real person.
Right.
It just means his actual life is something that's completely unknown to us. When I was a kid and I first started reading books about King Arthur, they always said he was totally fictional. He was just a character in folklore like Robin Hood or so forth. But gradually that idea changed. Historians started stumbling across things that they couldn't really explain very easily. And more experts were finding things in odd, obscure corners of history, indicating that there probably was a person, and he probably was named Arthur or Arturus or Arturio. The root word art is a Celtic word that means bear. So it's an auspicious name to give a kid. You want to grow up to be big and strong. So it would not have been an unusual name. So basically, to figure out if King Arthur lived, where did he live? So we'll talk about the historic Arthur first and then get into the legend. If you set your Wayback Machine for 410 AD, the Roman Empire was starting to fall apart. The fall of the Roman Empire was occurring. That took place over a period of about 200 years. Rome fell longer than most civilizations existed. So Rome was withdrawing its troops back to the mainland, back to Rome. They had conquered most of the known world. They had conquered England. They did not conquer Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. Probably because the weather was really bad up north, and let's face it, So they had changed the face of England the way Rome always does. They had created a mini Rome on the Thames, and they had brought over a class of landed gentry to work the land, who were all speaking Latin and raised and educated in Rome. They owned all the land. They taxed the people and used the taxes to build a really nice system of roads across the country, as Rome does. And then it came to an end. They had the order to withdraw and go back to Rome. And so all the soldiers packed up and left. And mind you, these soldiers were the only law in the entire country. So it'd be like, the Army, the Navy, and every police officer and the National Guard all vanished at the same time. And then add to that the fact that you were surrounded by barbarians, the Scottish, the Irish, and the Welsh, and who suddenly had a really great system of roads to travel on. And word got around pretty quickly that England was now basically bereft of an armed force. And so everybody who had an army in Europe started invading to seize whatever they could. You had various people who were Vikings, you had various groups. The Angles and the Saxons were the big ones, and the most important ones from our point of view. If it wasn't for them, we'd probably be speaking Welsh today. So everybody invaded, and suddenly the entire country was engulfed in chaotic bloodshed. Historians hate to use the word Dark Ages to describe the Middle Ages because that's a very prejudiced way of looking at it. But every historian who speaks about this period says, okay, this was really the Dark Age. The literacy rate in England dropped to below 1%. There were no written records because no one could write and no one could read them even if they were written. Everybody who had been to school left and went back to Rome. Everybody who had any management skills, who knew how to run something, left and went back to Rome to look for better prospects. So basically you were left with farmers and sheep herders being attacked by barbarians from the east and the west. So the Angles and the Celts, or the Angles and the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons, let's call them, were conquering most of the country. They wound up being the top dog when it came to seizing England. They started from the east coast and moved their way west, heading towards the country that was controlled by the Scottish, the Irish, and the Welsh. And around 500, something happened. Their progress to take over all of Great Britain came to a halt. And historians don't really know why. To this day, you can tell the accents of people in the east side of England and the west side of England have different accents because as the Anglo-Saxons only got so far and no further. So someone stopped them. There was someone, let's say he was a warlord, not a king because there were no kingdoms and there was no history of kingship in England at the time. Someone who gathered together enough of the disparate people and the barbarian tribes and held his own against the Anglo-Saxon invasion and actually pushed them back in some instances. There's evidence that territory they had gained, they lost. So that meant an organized army was fighting them.
But we don't know who.
We don't know who. But there was someone, some nameless person. We do know that a few hundred years after this happened, so getting after the year 500 AD, linguists discovered that among the tribal chieftains in the area, there were over 100 of them who named their firstborn son Arthur, which is the first time the name Arthur has cropped up in any history anywhere. It was an auspicious name. Arthur was a lucky name. It was an important name to name someone whom you expected to be king after you died. And there's a very old Celtic poem in which they go through the virtues of this one warrior. He had killed such and such men in battle on one day, and the ravens had feasted on his foes, and so forth and so on. And the last line of the poem is, but he was no Arthur. So all of a sudden, there's this name that crops up that no one's heard of before, and he's become the gold standard of warriors. He is the warrior that all other warriors are judged by, and his name is associated with kingship.
So you jump time frames, right?
Yeah.
Because
we're still in around between 500 and 600 AD.
So we're not suggesting that Arthur, King Arthur, is this unnamed warrior.
Yes.
Oh, we are.
That is exactly what we are suggesting.
Okay.
He didn't carry a magic sword, didn't have a city called Camelot, didn't wear plate mail armor. He probably wore boiled leather armor if he was lucky. But he was a warlord who organized a large number of people and saved England from being completely invaded. They were only half invaded. And he became the person that everyone in England at the time associated with leadership and with great skill. The name, generation after generation, people called their children Arthur.
Right.
No one knows who it was, but the name began to spread. And in a poem, if you say, but he was no Arthur, you're saying that because you don't have to explain to the audience who Arthur is, because everybody who could read that poem already knew Arthur's story so well. So a poet could use his name, and literally everyone would know exactly who he was talking about. He was that famous. We just can't find when he was born, when he died, or a single thing that we know he did. But that was how important he was, and that was how famous he was. And he's being talked about as if he were a real person, not a legendary figure at this point. So the theory is that this was the warlord who held off the Anglo-Saxon invasion, that became the leader that was a template for the mythical King Arthur. So the next step in the process is, so how did a handful of references to these historical things become the legend of King Arthur? And that is a long and twisty road, let me tell you. Having recently researched it, in 1130, which is about 600 years after the Arthur would have lived if he had lived.
Right.
Geoffrey of Monmouth was a cleric living in Monmouth in Wales, who England was basically an island, and you had Scotland, you had Ireland, you had Wales, and it had been conquered and reconquered by several different tribes. There was a lot of talk, was England actually a country, or was it just a place? Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth was from the school that England was a country. To be a country, you have to have a history. England had no history. Because again, a lot of important things happened in the Dark Ages when no one wrote anything down. So he was determined to use his skills as a cleric to find a history of England, even if he had to cobble it together from nothing. So he took Latin and Celtic sources, he took poems, he took songs, and he wove them together into something he called the History of the Kings of Britain. And he starts with survivors who fled the sacking of Troy arriving in England as the first settlers. So right away you're not dealing with a very serious history book. But he meant for it to be taken seriously. And only a few hundred years after he has the mythical refugees from Troy arriving, there is in fact a King Arthur who becomes the first High King of England, uniting everybody under one banner. This is the first reference to King Arthur, Geoffrey of Monmouth, 1130. He carried a sword called Caliburn, and he lived at a place called Carleon, which is almost Camelot. It's close. It's right up there. Also, because Geoffrey of Monmouth was from Wales, he was very familiar with Welsh folklore. So several elements from Welsh folklore turn up. Now, there have been a whole cycle of stories about a bard named Myrddin. He's Welsh, so he doesn't have nearly enough vowels in his name. It's sometimes spelled Mryddn.
A bard, is that a landowner?
No, a bard was a musician, a wandering musician and poet who would travel from town to town, entertaining people and also bringing news and gossip from one place to another.
Okay.
They were sacred in the time of the Druids. We've lost that by now, but the idea of bards being magical and things like that still is retained by the people. So Myrddin was a star of a whole cycle of stories, mythical stories about his skills and magical abilities. So Geoffrey interwove those stories into the stories of King Arthur that he was telling. So he gave King Arthur an assistant called Myrddin. And Arthur also had a lovely wife named Guinevere, which is also a Welsh name.
Okay.
You don't find names like that anywhere else. So by now you're starting to notice that the story of King Arthur is really fanfic.
Right.
It's one of the earliest and most successful versions of fanfic. It was all cobbled together by the fans. England needed a great king to look back to historically. And so Geoffrey gave them one. He gave them King Arthur. And right away, people liked the story. A guy named Wace translated this out of Latin into other languages. And he added in the story of the round table, all the knights sat around. So egalitarian things, there's no one at the head of the table. They were all equally sitting around a table. Where this comes from, no one knows. But Wace interposed it into Geoffrey of Monmouth's story. So that was 1130. Now, a couple hundred years later, we reached 1200. This is when it really starts to get complicated. By 1200, these stories have been translated into French. And the French adored it. A guy whose name I will mispronounce, Chrétien de Troyes. Chrétien de Troyes was a poet and a writer in France in 1200. He liked the King Arthur stories so much, he started writing his own. New King Arthur stories were being turned out by this guy. 1200 was the Middle Ages. We're into the high Middle Ages now. So he took a character who is a distinctly French character, Lancelot du Lac. which means Lancelot of the Lake in French. He invented Lancelot, lover, fighter, the best knight in King Arthur's court. A distinctly French character who sails across the Channel to join the British King Arthur. He also took the story of Percival, which originally was Parzival, a German character, who was on a quest for a Grail. Not the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail hasn't been invented yet. Parzival is looking for a Grail. It's a magic Grail. It's a magic cup, or possibly a magic plate, or a magic serving platter. A magic something you could serve food or drink on that was missing, and he was looking for it. De Troyes never got around to finishing Parzival's story. 3 or 4 other writers after his death took up the mantle and wrote more Parzival stories. Now, the other thing that happened is a couple of funny things happened. Apparently, Chrétien de Troyes had his own Patreon page where people could give him money to help his creative career. So if you were one of his sponsors, you gave him money and he would write what you wanted to write. He would literally change what he was writing if you gave him enough money. So he had rich people becoming his patrons, giving him money to write things.
Sounds inspiring.
Yes, it was very inspiring for his bank account, that's for sure. A woman who was from a famous court, and I can't remember her name right now, so we'll skip over her actual name. She was very invested in the concept of courtly love. Now, courtly love had just been invented in the Middle Ages. Basically, it was a really nice, sweet form of adultery, where you fall in love with a woman who was untouchable, usually somebody else's wife. Now, at the time this was written, courtly love was considered to be purely a good, ennobling thing. Being in love made you a better person. The fact that you were in love with someone you could never actually be with was unimportant. It was all about the loves. Being in love made you a better person, a better knight, a better warrior. You would dedicate all of your victories to your lady love. Sometimes you'd have to keep it secret so the husband wouldn't kill you. So there were knights that served women who didn't know they had knights serving them. Yeah. But this is all considered to be a good thing. This encouraged knights to go out and kill more giants, because that way you could prove how dedicated you were to your lady love. It was all a little twisted. But this was seen as the standard. This was the ideal for knights. And since he introduced Lancelot into the legend, you know what happens next if you know anything about Camelot. Yeah. It winds up not ending well, but Chrétien de Troyes doesn't see it that way. He sees Lancelot's intense devotion, almost obsessive devotion to Guinevere, as being a wholly good thing. Because in 1200, there was no negative side to this. The reason for that was that most marriages were marriages, for rich people, were marriages of state.
Right.
Yeah. There's a choice, but it's not yours. Guinevere was a princess from another kingdom. And her marriage to Arthur was a political marriage. She's never described as being unhappy, but when Lancelot comes along, her eye does start to stray pretty darn quickly. So Chrétien de Troyes added in the love triangle. Okay. Which had never been in any other version of the story. So this circulated for like another couple of hundred years. You had something called the Vulgate Psycho, which is a Latin translation of all of this. That was a Latin translation of de Troyes' translation from Geoffrey of Monmouth. And by this time, it was the 13th century, and Christianity had really taken hold. Not just a little bit. The Christian church was the church. They ruled the world. And so the idea of a story that was mostly at this point still completely pagan, with like fairies and dragons running around with no Christian subtext to it, just wasn't going to happen. So Christian themes started to be added in, trying to reinterpret things from a Christian standpoint. Now, meanwhile, hundreds of other people have written new King Arthur stories, or new stories about Arthur's knights. Normally, they'll tell a story about their own creation. It's fanfic, after all. So you make up your fanfic character, and you say, Sir Edward, a knight of King Arthur's court, went out one day, and then tell a story about Sir Edward. He is a knight of King Arthur's court, but King Arthur and his court aren't important. That's just become the setting for everybody else's fanfic. So I've seen a book like massively thick, just with lost King Arthur stories that didn't make the cut.
Wow.
Yeah. And most of them, Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere, don't really do anything except sit on their throne and occasionally make wise comments or congratulate them on their victory or condemn them for their failure, Arthur had become an inactive hero who didn't really do anything. Then eventually Sir Thomas Mallory came along. Ugh. This is Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Mallory. I won't pretend I've read it. It's the size of a small encyclopedia.
It really is.
It's huge. This is the uncut version. Yeah. It's in the back waiting to be cataloged. I can't imagine anyone would really want to check it out. I probably will put it on the shelf, and I'm sure someone will check it out. But right now, it's been sitting in the back for a while. It's huge. So Mallory took the Vulgate Psycho, which was in a poem, the form of a poem, and he made a prose version of it. And it will not surprise you to learn that he made massive changes along the way. At this point, you've seen that coming, right? So 1485, Thomas Mallory does his version on the whole thing. Now, 1485, again, a couple hundred years after the last version was written, Thomas Mallory was probably, and there's several different Thomas Mallorys, so we're not even completely certain this is the one, was himself a knight. He was Sir Thomas Mallory.
Okay.
However, he was in prison for rape and several other lesser charges. He wrote this while in prison.
Okay.
So he had lots of time to do research. 1485 was the middle of the War of the Roses in England, where the Lancasters and the Yorks were fighting for the throne. It was a vicious, violent, bloody civil war that stretched out for a couple of hundred years. Mallory's real crime probably wasn't rape or horse theft, but switching sides in the middle of the War of the Roses.
Right.
Which virtually everybody did at some point. Everybody betrayed everybody by the end of the War of the Roses. So it was obvious that England had fallen on hard times as a civilized nation.
Okay.
And Mallory was part of a class of people who saw that. And one aspect of Christendom is the fallen state of man. How far have we fallen from that golden age? In the Bible, the golden age was the Garden of Eden. But in England, the golden age was the time of King Arthur.
Right. Well,
So he looked around and realized that the standards that Arthur set are not being upheld by our current generation of kings. And so he tried to rewrite the story of Arthur as a patriotic piece to tell people how they should be living during the War of the Roses.
at what point in time did the concept of the golden age of King Arthur actually come about, given that we're sort of just taking bits and it's a snowball that occurs
Probably
over
it was
time.
Mallory that really drove that home. People looked at the chaotic state of things and thought it was better before this all began. And since historically speaking, England's always been kind of a violent place, the time when it was really good was when King Arthur was the only king in England. He had settled all disputes, and his ruled the land. Mallory was also very Christian, so he accepted the idea that Arthur had a magician as an assistant. He liked Merlin, but we all know that magic has to come from either God or the devil. And if God didn't send Merlin, then he was an agent of the devil. So he made Merlin the son of a demon, an incubus, that his mother summoned. So his powers were evil, although Merlin tried to use them for good. So his eternal conflict, because Christian authors love that, is a fight against the evil nature of his soul. Merlin was basically evil, but he was trying to do good. Now, in this time period, between 1200 and 1485, adultery was no longer cool.
Okay.
So he saw Lancelot's love for Guinevere as tainting King Arthur's court.
What prompted this change?
Christianity, the Catholic Church.
Okay.
adultery couldn't be seen in a good light ever. It was always wrong. It was a sin under any circumstances. To look at a woman with lust is to automatically commit adultery with her.
Okay.
So just the fact that Lancelot looked at her, it meant he was doomed, and by extension, all of Camelot was doomed. All of that comes from Mallory. Mallory invented the idea of pulling a sword from a stone.
Very disappointed.
Yeah. It was Mallory who made the Grail the Holy Grail. Again, everything has to come from Christ. So the Holy Grail was the Holy Grail. We'll talk about that later. That's a part of a whole nother myth cycle.
I may have missed. So was Mallory himself a Christian?
Yes,
Okay.
he was. He invented Galahad. Galahad is the ultimate Mary Sue. Galahad is handsomer than Lancelot, does everything better than Lancelot. He's the only one who can bring back the Holy Grail. He also interweaves the Parzival cycle of stories with King Arthur. Mm-hmm. So the Parzival stories that started in Germany. So Parzival's quest to find a Grail became Parzival's holy quest to discover the Grail, which he of course fails at because he's just not as cool as Galahad, let's face it. Yeah, Galahad is such a Mary Sue. It's hysterical to read these things. He also introduced Morgan Le Fay as a villain. Morgan Le Fay's name literally means Morgan the Fay.
Right.
She was a fairy, and fairies are evil under Christian terms. So Morgan had appeared as a minor character in other versions of the story, but she'd always been canonically neutral or benevolent. Mm-hmm. As authors like wiser older sister.
Right.
Now she was just a bad guy. And that's why Morgan's interpretation in pop culture varies widely across the board. Wikipedia even devotes an entire page to different versions of Morgan Le Fay that appear in pop culture. It was also Mallory who invented the idea of Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son, who ultimately ends his life.
So wait, did he also concoct the idea of Morgan being the result of King Arthur's father raping her mother?
Kind of, sort of. He combined several different things together. The important thing was Morgan became the eternal enemy of Camelot.
Okay.
Her schemes to destroy Arthur and Camelot were the driving force behind a lot of the stories.
Okay.
She was the evil agent behind virtually everything that happened. It was Morgan Le Fay all along, they discovered at some point. And he also really drove home the idea of chivalry. A guy who himself was a knight who was in prison. The idea that knights had a code of honor you had to adhere to. You just had to be kind and humble and gentle with people unless you're going to kill them, in which case you kill them quickly and without torturing them. The idea there was a code of honor that you had to live by. And by 1485, the idea there had ever been an age of chivalry was already tossed out the window. But he wanted to bring it back. That's part of the golden age when the people who were in power cared about the people who weren't in power. That was the ideal goal of a knight. And Arthur he wanted to see as the ideal king, putting him in sharp contrast to the kings that he had known in his life and the knights that he had known, including perhaps himself.
Okay.
So he's putting forth the idea of what a king of England should be like, and in a sense what England should be like. That sense of noblesse oblige, of the upper class taking care of the lower class. Mm-hmm. What people in England pretended was true for centuries. That was really important to Mallory, and that became a driving force behind King Arthur. And I think this is the point in which Arthur comes to represent England, mm-hmm. that most British of all kings, embodying those things that England thought was cool at whatever time period you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So Mallory really, in a sense, he was trying to write the last word on Arthur, retconning certain things that didn't make sense, combining all the different versions into one, which is why it's so thick, because it's several different sources put together. So there's a lull of several hundred years. Arthur was important to England, but there was a lot of uncomfortable elements. He didn't get popular again until the Victorian age, when they had an obsession with romanticism. They were obsessed with the past and the glory days of the past, and what was more glorious than the time of King Arthur. Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote Idylls of the King, a great poem about the days of Arthur, and put him back in public consciousness again. And then a couple of years passed, and World War I came along, which kind of killed the idea of chivalry and noblesse oblige, and World War I really drove into the dirt a lot of things people held sacred in England. So while they were still reeling from the massive losses in World War I, World War II came along. In 1940, T.H. White wrote The Once and Future King. And by this point, it had become very clear that Arthur was a tool that existed to be hijacked for political purposes. So T.H. White sat down and wrote the story of King Arthur.
I'm sorry, we just segued into him becoming political somehow?
Yeah. He represented England. So when you want to write about King Arthur, you're really writing about England. You're saying something about the nature of the British people.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like I said, Mallory did that specifically to draw back to that we should follow the old ways that King Arthur had of chivalry rather than being the brutal, lustful, horrible people that we really are.
But we also established that didn't actually
It never actually happened. Like much nostalgia, it's hearkening back to a golden age that never existed.
So what was he actually referring to? Or he was trying to create rather than go back? Was he aware of that?
On some level, he probably was. He was inventing a myth of a golden age so that we can all talk about how great it was and try to go back there again.
Okay.
Yeah. Tricky stuff. T.H. White wrote Once and Future King in several different volumes. The first volume, Sword in the Stone, was famously made into a cartoon by Disney that deals with Arthur growing up.
You're really digging into my childhood memories here.
A big chunk of it was adapted for the movie Camelot, which was a musical, which I saw as a kid. I really loved it. But he was writing in 1940, and he was basically saying what a lot of what Arthur does is like quell the different warring like factions in England and get them all to work together, which is a very strong message to give to the world in 1940. So he was writing about what he wants from a British king, a British prime minister, shall we say, at the time when England was going through its darkest hour.
Well, from what I understand, the same applies to superheroes in terms of comics here in America. The idea that, a hero can come along and bring light to these very dark.
Exactly. In fact, Once in Future King refers to the myth that Arthur, having died, will come back again in England's greatest hour of need, which many people thought was, World War II. He had obviously taken the Arthur myth and used it for his own political purposes, showing what he wanted from England at this time period, which was 1940.
Who is this again?
T.H. White.
Okay.
Mostly a poet. A lot of this was written by poets. Once in Future King was very popular for a long time. It fell out of favor after a while. It's not as popular now as it used to be, partly because it's not those days anymore. JFK was a huge fan of the play Camelot. And when he died unexpectedly, it was very much a fall of Camelot moment for America. The death of Kennedy was associated with the death of Arthur by dozens of writers at the time. It was seen as very much of a parallel. But there are thousands of King Arthur stories that are still being printed to this day. I've got dozens of them in my section. The most famous retelling of relatively recent vintage, 1983, was Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. She was a feminist and a pagan, and it will not surprise you to learn that she altered the myth of King Arthur to bring women to the forefront of prominence, and the pagan aspects of it that had been so crushed to death by Christians over the years and now suddenly became predominant.
So did Morgan Le Fay remain a villain?
Oh no, she's a hero. She's kind of a tragic hero in this one. But she's trying to do what's right, but she's opposed by the forces of Christendom, and Guinevere, who is a Christian, and wants to purge her dear husband of the evil pagan elements. And so, Guinevere and Morgan are kind of have a good girl, bad girl vibe going. And Arthur in this one is mostly manipulated entirely by the women in his life. And that was hugely popular. A very big hit for Marion Zimmer Bradley. And again, the story is being reinterpreted constantly all the time. So that is the more or less historical version.
It's a lot to digest.
It is a lot to digest. We haven't even gotten to the myth.
So it's almost like a living document.
It is, or fanfic, if you will. But yeah, it's there are new stories of King Arthur still being told, so his legend is still alive in a way that, other characters aren't from history or mythology.
Yeah.
He's a folklore character rather than a mythological character. But his prevalence in pop culture, if you live anywhere in the English-speaking world, you've heard of King Arthur.
So, how do they perceive it there? Do they think of it? Do they think of him as a myth or something more real?
I think he's held up as an ideal. He doesn't have to have been real to be important, as any folklore expert will tell you. Things that never happened are sometimes extremely important from a historical standpoint. The fact that there was a King Arthur, the fact that there was a warlord who probably was called Arthur, is unimportant to the fact that the idea of King Arthur and Camelot became a symbol of England, of all of Western civilization.
I was also wondering, on the timeline there, where does that stack up against so Braveheart, William Wallace? While we know Braveheart is not necessarily truth, there's the possibility.
Although William Wallace did exist and did a lot of the cool things.
Okay, so what time frame was that in relation to this?
I don't know the date that occurred. I can find that for you next week.
Okay.
But that is how we got to where we are now with King Arthur.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It really is. A little sad.
Yeah, but would you like him more if he was real? Real people almost never live up to your expectations. They certainly don't live up to 20th century standards.
Well, if William Wallace did even a quarter, then my expectations are good.
Yeah.
No, I like the idea. I like the idea of him being a real person.
Yeah.
I also appreciate the value of, just the ideology of his qualities. But but no, I think I would hope that he would have been real.
Yeah, we don't know anything about the historic person that very probably lived. He didn't have access to the sword, the castle, and things like that. In one of the recent films called King Arthur, Arthur is actually a Roman centurion who stays behind rather than going back. So he has access to Roman armor and weapons, and his handful of, quote, knights are the Roman legionnaires that stay with him. And in this one, Guinevere is the leader of a Celtic tribe with like blue, body paint and everything. Which might actually be the way it was. There's no evidence that was accurate. But if you want to talk history, that's not a bad interpretation. That could have happened.
A lot to consider.
Yeah. The fact that we don't know means scholars, linguists, historians, archaeologists are still working.
The fact that they added these features, like the castle, the sword, is that indicative of anything in relation to the foundation of the story?
Not really. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about the world in 1130 the way he knew it. So in a sense, he was writing a contemporary story, even though he told the readers it happened in the past. The same way when Thomas Mallory was writing about it in 1485, he's describing the huge castles that he knows are all over England, as if he's imagining Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot all in a castle, that he's familiar with, despite the fact they clearly weren't. And he says that. He doesn't say they lived in this kind of a country, and yet the country he describes was England in the 1400s.
Okay.
All right. So we'll dive into what the myth is next week, and I'll try to come up with a coherent timeline of key events in the lives of Arthur and the circle of people around him so it almost makes sense.
Sounds good.
All right, so I have more next week. Until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
See you next time. Until then, be safe.